All right, welcome to week 3 of our project called Seek Growth. And in this project, every week we look at a different piece of the Jewish calendar in this time of year, but also the corresponding character strength and the view from positive psychology. And in week 1, we looked at
kindness.
Yeah. Week 2, we looked at fairness. And now week 3 in Hebrew is Tiferet, which is confusing because it's the name of the program that Milken does where they send 10th graders to Israel first semester, but it really means beauty. And as an attribute of God, Tiferet is a really interesting one. Tiferet, beauty, is essentially the creation of the world and everything in it. When we look in the beginning of the Jewish Bible, the book of Genesis, God made the world and he said, let there be light, let there be waters from the earth, let there be great animals and trees and everything like that. And after each day it says that it was good. And this good is not just that it's a good thing to have, trees and whatever, but it's actually like a beautiful thing. And so today we're looking at beauty as an attribute of what God used to create the world, but then also how do we think about and appreciate and stop and notice beauty, excellence in different ways in our own lives in a way to enhance them. Is that all correct?
All correct.
Okay, so Dr. Holden's going to start us off with talking about what, in terms of positive psychology and character strength, does beauty, excellence, and the appreciation thereof actually mean?
Right. So kind of like what you described, there's different types of beauty and excellence. But as a character strength is something that can be developed and something that we can cultivate, right? Our own ability to see beauty and excellence. We should be incentivized to do so for a variety of reasons. It's highly associated with other character strengths like gratitude, which has huge associations with happiness, with optimism, and with pro-social behaviors. It's tremendously associated with curiosity and love of learning and creativity, which all play a part in intrinsic motivation and sort of like optimal experiences. And it's highly associated with kindness. So we're going to break it up into sort of 3 different categories, right? Admiration, awe, and elevation. But before we do that, I think you're going to share some blessings with us that speak to it a little bit more from the Jewish perspective.
So that's right. So when Dr. Holden and I first started talking about what does the appreciation of beauty, the recognition of beauty mean in the Jewish tradition, the first thing that I thought of is it's almost like a mindfulness thing.
Yeah.
There's
savoring, we'd call it.
Savoring.
Yeah.
Good. Savoring, which I guess is part of mindfulness in a certain way. There's certain things that in the Jewish tradition you're supposed to notice every single day, and there's you're supposed to stop and actually say a blessing over these things. Now, on the simple level, it's like every piece of food you eat or water you drink, you stop and say a blessing before. But maybe more connected to what we think of appreciation and beauty are things like that you would notice in nature. So I'm looking at a prayer book, a Siddur here right now, and there's a blessing for smelling the fragrance of a tree or a plant or an herb. There's, if you smell a fruit, if you see a rainbow, even if you do see a mountain or a shooting star, and it's not just that. It's like even if you see like an animal. Let's see, I guess I was in Big Sur a couple weeks ago, and you see like a herd of deer next to the road. Like there's a blessing that you say for that. Yeah. And then it's not even just like natural beauty, but if you experience, if you're in the presence of someone who's like an incredible genius in any area of thinking, there's a special blessing you say. Like
skills and talents.
Talents, you're recognizing, you're admiring like what this world has to offer. And I guess in a sort of going against human nature, and maybe we'll get into this, I don't know, this is a complicated one, but like human nature is to like look at the bad, focus on the negative.
Negativity bias.
Bias. I walk out my door and I notice the piece of trash instead of like the beautiful flowers that have just bloomed.
Right.
And all these blessings in the Jewish tradition are helping us, there's going to be some term for this, like refocus our attention from the one piece of trash that we can easily just go and pick up. Instead of complaining about that, we're recognizing and celebrating and thanking God in a certain sense for all the beautiful things around us.
And that's why it's so highly associated with gratitude. Is on the surface level, gratitude is really about just pausing to notice the good and appreciate the good, right? It's the number one correlation with appreciation of beauty and excellence.
And even in other areas like big controversy, debate among students right now are the NBA playoffs. And it's easy to focus on like mistakes that the refs make.
Mm-hmm.
But like you can also focus on like how incredible the players are. Even if you feel like there's some injustice because they missed a call, like appreciate how amazing like your opponent is and how beautiful the game is. I know that's a little controversial, but that's what I was thinking about as well. So that's like a little bit of where this idea comes from in the Jewish tradition. From my perspective, God created a beautiful world. There's moral beauty. There's physical beauty. There's art and everything in it. And that's like an aspect of the divine from the Jewish tradition. And then we have to respond to that by noticing it, by celebrating it, by making it part of our lives on an ongoing basis. So that's like what we're supposed to be working on in this third of 7 weeks.
Right. And so what we've been doing is in each installment, we've kind of been laying out for the folks watching or listening kind of interventions or strategies for seeking growth, right? How do you actually cultivate kindness in week 1? How do you think about and develop fairness in week 2? And so today we want to talk about how do you think about and develop and actually experience the appreciation of beauty and excellence. And to do that, we're going to lay out, I think, a pretty simple sort of activity or intervention, and then you and I will just do it with one another, right? We'll talk about how we go about these 3 things.
Right.
So before we jump into that, we got to talk about what the 3 things are, right? You laid out a bunch of different blessings, and I said that they could be sort of categorical. Mm-hmm. So the first one of these categories is awe. And awe basically has to do with beauty. You mentioned the rainbow, the fresh blooming flowers. You and I were just on the 9th grade trip. Mm-hmm. The trip over, we saw 3 whales. We saw dozens of dolphins. We saw, I think, a sea lion. I mean, it was crazy, right? We saw so much. And that's awe, right? That's beauty and wonder.
And that could be in nature. It can be in art. It could be in music.
Absolutely. It
could be in poetry,
Absolutely.
fashion, whatever.
Yeah. Well, to your point, even athletics, right? It's not just skill and talent. Sometimes there's, being a soccer guy, like there's a certain style of play. It's literally called the beautiful game for a reason, right?
Not in America, but yeah.
Yeah, not in America, but when played in a sort of an ideal fashion, it's the beautiful game. Right? So the second type would be admiration. And admiration is really that skill and talent piece. And you just mentioned it again with sports, but it also could be art, music, whatever. Not the music or the art itself, but the people or the processes behind it that create these beautiful outcomes, right? Appreciating the talent and the skill that went into those things.
Like, I don't like watching ballet, but there might be moments where I'm like, how can that person do that?
Yeah,
that's incredible.
Absolutely. It just kind of defies what you think is physically possible on some levels, right? There's plenty of things in life that I don't necessarily enjoy, but I still appreciate and respect, right?
Curling.
On a talent level. Curling could be one. Yeah. And then the third piece, and I think we probably agree this is what is maybe the most interesting, is elevation. And elevation is essentially that warm, sort of like tingly feeling we get on a physiological level when we witness moral goodness. Okay? And elevation is really interesting because it, in many ways, motivates us to do good. It makes us more altruistic. It makes us more pro-social. And we experience elevation when we witness and appreciate the beauty of the moral goodness of an individual or the moral goodness of an act or an experience. So what we're going to do is we'll go through awe, admiration, and elevation, and just each one of us will provide examples of what creates those experiences for us and maybe a little bit about what it feels like to us in those moments.
So instead of talking about what we want our viewers, listeners to do, we're going to do it.
Yep.
We're going to do it right now. And and we are going to notice and stop to think about and discuss different types of beauty and excellence as a practice right now.
That's right. And then when we finish the episode, we hope that everybody at home will do the same.
Okay, so now we are looking at these three categories of beauty and excellence: awe, admiration, elevation. We're each going to give some examples as a way of sort of elevating ourselves and focusing on what this character strength, what this Jewish value is of appreciating different types of beauty. So I'll start with awe, right? And awe is specifically, as you mentioned before, experiencing a certain type of beauty. And I'll say that, we're sitting here recording it soon after our spring break, our Passover break. And I think I told you, I might have even shown you pictures already, that went hiking with my family up in the Golan Heights, up in the northern mountainous area of Israel. And they had a lot of rain recently, and just the incredible array of wildflowers in the mountains, and taking a hike in sort of the warm sun and appreciating the view, and specifically with my 4-year-old daughter. It was the most intense hike by far that she's ever been able to do. And part of it is just like experiencing that beauty of nature. And like I mentioned before, there's these blessings that you say when you see the flowers budding for the first time, or you smell them. And to me, that's that experience of nature. And it's happening in LA right now also. Amazing, I guess, proliferation of wildflowers. Yeah. And to me, that's a really, that makes me stop and appreciate the world around me in a new way.
Yeah, that's great. For me, it's as a lot of the folks know, I'm originally from Michigan. Most of my family still lives there, and my folks have a cottage. There's a big up north lake culture in Michigan, and they have a cottage on Lake Michigan, on the big lake. And when we're up there together, a lot of what we do is just take walks on the beach. And for me in particular, it's not just the simple walk on the beach, but anytime a storm rolls in and you can watch it roll in over the lake, or a great sunset, or if I'm up early enough, a great sunrise, those are sort of the moments for me where they're a little bit more distinguishable. Like, we see a lot of sunsets, we see a lot of rain and a lot of storms, but when you can get kind of the full picture of rolling in over the lake or falling below like the horizon, that's a pretty unique, awe-inspiring experience.
Have you been there recently?
Not since the summer, no. I got a little bit of that actually when you and I were on the 9th grade trip. Because I'd wake up and go do like a sunrise sort of hike and try and catch it coming over the water a little bit, but not quite the same thing.
And on that same trip, something that many of our students noticed, which I loved watching them notice this, is there's all these like tall grasses, and it was extremely windy, and they were pointing out that the grass looks like waves in the ocean and how like beautiful it is. And I was getting sort of like secondhand awe by seeing how in awe of nature our students were. And you mentioned before, like the wildlife we saw in the ocean around there, etc.
The island foxes.
That's exactly.
There are a lot of cool stuff on that trip. Yeah.
So that's our appreciation of beauty that we've seen recently, or that we think about when we feel those moments of awe. And now we're going to admiration. Right. You want to start with what you think of as admiration?
Yeah, admiration is a big one for me. Now that I'm getting into the research a little bit more, it's one of those things that I realize I've always kind of been interested in or really enjoyed as an experience. I just never necessarily had a label for it. But anyone that watches Netflix realizes they have so many good documentaries, and so that exposes you to a ton of talented people. So anything from cooking shows, I mention this in my Positive Psych class all the time, but Euro Dreams of Sushi, I've watched probably 5-6 times. There's another one on the history of like 90s hip hop called Stretch and Bobbito. This New York-based hip hop show that kind of broke a lot of up-and-coming artists. But movies and talented people, and the one that stands out the most specifically is a series, again, on Netflix called Abstract. which is it's an 8-episode series about different types of designers: interior design, stage design, architects, and the coolest one, which a lot of our students will appreciate, is episode 2, which is Tinker Hatfield, and he's a sneaker designer for Nike. He's responsible for the Jordan line, the Air Maxes, among others. And I'm not a sneakerhead by any means. I don't have a particular appreciation for shoes, but just like learning about him and his way of thinking and his talent and how he problem solves, that inspired great admiration. And likewise, the Danish architect who's just done the most amazing structures. Episode 4 is a Danish architect who's just done he did like the Lego house and a bunch of amazing structures. And I don't know the first thing about architecture, but just watching him creates a great deal of admiration because you just realize he's on this talent and cognitive level that is almost hard to access.
Right. So watching or reading about or hearing about like a person who's excelling in their field in some way, that even if you're not like a foodie, but you see what a chef has dedicated his life to perfecting sushi, which seems so simple, there's like incredible admiration in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what are your examples?
Yeah, my example for admiration, I'm similar. Everything that you said, like I love watching a show or reading a book about one person who's dedicated their life to something, and sometimes there are complicated stories, like people who sacrifice like the relationship with their family in order to,
I think of Steve Jobs.
Right. So Steve Jobs, like, is it Gyro? Dreams of Sushi?
Yeah.
Okay, so his...
Well, I don't know how you pronounce it. J-I-R-O.
J-I-R-O.
I should clarify, yeah.
Okay.
If that's Japanese and I slaughtered it, I apologize.
But yeah, the idea of someone who's really put their whole being into something. My favorite author, and we've spoken about him before, David Foster Wallace, his writing is... There's two things about his writing that... every time I read it, I'm reminded of how much I admire him and how beautiful his writing is. One is like just the playfulness with the words, just like the words and how they are pieced together on the page. To me, are really amazing. And then also like as a writer, like a painter, or many different types of artists, just like sees the world in a certain way and looks around the world in a certain way. And by reading their account of human behavior, the world around them, like I admire their ability to observe the world. And so to me, that's looking at his writing is really a moving experience in that way.
Yeah, I think that's probably where it ties back to things like curiosity and creativity and love of learning, because I think when we expose ourselves to these other elements of life or other people that we admire, it's in many ways like inspirational, and it kind of pushes you to look for more, right? Like, oh, that felt good. It taught me a little bit of something. I experienced a sense of personal growth. Like, I want more of that. How do I get more of that, right?
Yeah.
So the third one then is elevation. You want to start us off with elevation?
Yeah, elevation, which just is really not looking at something that's just strikingly beautiful or something that you really admire in what someone has accomplished, but it's looking at a moment or action or example of moral goodness, right?
Yeah.
And as we're recording this, we're falling in the time of the year where we commemorate the Holocaust, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the first thing that I thought of is one of the most moving parts of this day for me, as the grandson of Holocaust survivors, is the story of sacrifice for others that are so much a part of my own family history. My grandfather survived the Holocaust in part because a Polish Catholic family was willing to put him in their barn and risk their own lives so that he can potentially live. And he felt forever indebted to them for that sacrifice. And when he had extra money around, he'd send them a little gift and sort of stayed in touch. And that's just one small story, but the idea of what it means to like really put yourself at risk to sacrifice for what you believe in for someone else, to me, it's an example of like moral goodness that I try to remember this time of year in particular.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think it situates itself kind of in the juxtaposition that I was going to create with a couple examples where, I think when you think about elevation and witnessing moral goodness, it's easy to go to these like enigmatic leaders throughout history, right? Especially for me being a former history teacher, and I know you're interested in history, and obviously there's a great deal of these figures in Jewish history. So I immediately think of like a Gandhi type figure, right? And I've always enjoyed that movie. Again, it's quite inspirational, but you're basically witnessing a ton of moral goodness. But I think what's interesting about elevation and when we're talking about seeking growth and doing this program, it's how do you kind of refine the ability to appreciate and experience elevation. And I think that can be found in some of the more like granular behaviors of a given day. So I think of like if we pull back to episode 1 in kindness, we talked about giver behavior. Mm-hmm. Even just stopping here at work at Milken to say or notice, the kids when they do something nice for each other, a colleague who does a favor for somebody else, just even when you just see them execute what you hope they're learning as sort of morality in the context of a school like this, stopping to appreciate that. But also just the day-to-day of it all. The people that come to mind the most are my immediate family members, my parents and my 2 sisters, as well as, frankly, my brother-in-law and I think probably future brother-in-law. Like every single one of them is a better human being than I, and they, I think, create that experience of elevation where like I want to
You're practicing humility right now, which is another character.
I'm practicing honesty, but they're just really good, decent people. Not just in the way that they volunteer, but that the way they interact with everyone they come across too. And that I think growing up witnessing that. Grandparents as well, kind of like your point about the coming from a family of Holocaust survivors. It's pretty hard to grow up in those sort of contexts and not really notice that sort of elevation experience.
And I think you're making a good point, which is elevation, like noticing moral goodness and really appreciating and taking the time to appreciate like we would a great piece of art or nature.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be like the willingness to sacrifice your life for someone else.
Yeah.
It could be something much smaller. And I think the examples in a school are good examples. Like, the kid who goes out of his way to, include someone in something that is otherwise often excluded. Like those small acts of goodness, like should be celebrated and appreciated and noticed like art, like nature. And that's like, that will not only like make for a better community or society, but like it's selfishly like it helps us enjoy our lives and find meaning in it.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge going forward, to the students, parents, community members that are watching this is not only how can you experience awe, admiration, and elevation, but how can you, behave in ways that also create it for other people, right? They witness it in you. And in that way, you can make it a bit more contagious.
Right. And coming sort of full circle, like if the original idea of tiferet, of beauty in the Jewish tradition comes from God's basic creation of a beautiful world, like how do we, in the Jewish language, how do we partner with God in making the world more and more beautiful through the ways in which we create art or music or just kindness and make the world around us a more beautiful place as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
All right, good talk.
Yeah, this has been Appreciation of Beauty and Excellence. This is week 3. We will be headed into week 4 next week. I can't remember offhand what's on the docket, but I'm sure it'll be fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much.